Hello, welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome everybody to the latest in the Analytics8 Data Dialogue series. This one entitled 5 Steps to Optimize Your DBT Implementation. Analytics8 is a data analytics consultancy based in Chicago. We're a DBT Labs premier consulting partner. We're really excited to talk about this topic with you today. My name is Amos Budde. I'm the head of alliances and channels at Analytics8. My role today is to be our guide. I'm going to lead us in some conversation, asking questions of our resident expert. Speaking of, the other person you will hear from today is Tyler Rouze. Tyler is a managing consultant at Analytics8. Tyler also leads the DBT practice and Center of Excellence at Analytics8. So he's personally been involved in perhaps dozens of our DBT engagements that we've done at Analytics8. And so he is the perfect person to talk with us today about this topic, which is essentially Analytics8's consolidated learnings about how to optimize a DBT implementation. And we're going to provide you with a playbook so you can do this at your own organization. We call it a project health check. Other people might call it paying down technical debt. But the idea is the same, to make sure that you as an organization are always implementing according to best practices. So here's us. A quick housekeeping note. This conversation is going to be 30 minutes long. And because we respect your time, we'll end promptly at the half hour. Please use the Zoom chat for any questions you have during the call. We'll answer them near the end. And you can reach out to us afterwards and we'll get back to you. So speaking of the Zoom chat, let's get to know each other a little bit better. If you are so inclined, please type into the chat your name, where you're hailing from today, and how long did you start using DBT at your current organization? I would say, for example, my name's Amos, I'm in Minneapolis. My company started using DBT 2 years ago, although for Analytics8 it might actually be 3 at this point. But anyway, let's get started. Tyler, first question for you, just to sort of frame this issue. In your experience, why do companies choose to use DBT in the first place?
Yeah, it's a loaded question, just to start there. And as every consultant loves to say, it depends. I think it depends on where your organization is coming from and like, are you thinking of it more from an executive standpoint or more from a technical standpoint? My favorite way to answer this question, though, is really like thinking about DBT as a tool. It's really just abstracting away a lot of the SQL parts that we have to rewrite all the time. If you've come from a place where you're writing a lot of stored procedures in your database, DBT abstracts away a lot of that more lower level technical stuff that is just too detailed that we can abstract it away and we don't have to do all of it all the time. And the reason why this is important is because what DBT really allows your organization to do is to take folks who are more of a data analyst role and less technical, maybe not quite engineers, but are pretty good and can write plenty of SQL and write reports and stuff like that, and take them from that role and have them actually develop on your data platform, actually write transformation code. You might be asking, why is that important that I have my data analysts write transformation code? I'm glad you asked. And really the answer to that genuinely is that data transformation is really how we define logic about our business in code, right? And so you're writing like a case when statement about this column should say this when something is true in our data, right? And it is generally the data analysts who know this stuff the best. They're the ones that work closely with the business, but also have the skills to actually build on DBT. And so that's genuinely why I love DBT and why I think every company should be using a tool like DBT, if not DBT, is that it's able to take what historically has been a lot of engineers developing stuff on your database and just kind of taking requests and trying to just give me your requirements and I'll go do the thing. And it's more about having a partnership really between your data team and what your end use cases actually are with your business, right? Actually trying to derive value from your data. And so that's at least why I hope companies use DBT. That's why I love DBT and have been using it for a long time, and love doing stuff like this to talk more about it. So
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think we're big fans of DBT at Analytics8. I guess the question is like, why do you think I'm sort of going to lead you to the answer with our slide that we've made. But I guess the question is like, why do we need to consider optimization? Why do we need to consider potentially doing, a deep dive into how everything is deployed in order to be most successful here? And I guess if you can also elaborate based on some of your experience, what are some examples of pitfalls you've seen as people try to leverage a DBT and as things get more complex?
yeah, it's a great question. And sometimes DBT can be a victim of its own success in that it really is easy to use and get started with. We've seen it before where a client's come to us and they're like, yeah, someone on our team just spun it up and started using it because they have credentials and could connect to their data warehouse. And so sometimes it's that you started out using DBT because it was so easy, you didn't put a lot of forethought into, okay, are we actually building our project in the right way? And if that's not the case for you, like that's great. And hopefully you've had some time to understand the tool before saying, okay, hey, we're gonna go and bring this in and we're gonna add this to our stack. But we've seen that a lot where companies have just kind of started using it and it's kind of grown. And I'm sure DBT is not the only tool where this is, I'm sure, happened at companies before where somebody brings something in and all of a sudden it becomes way more than anybody thought it was going to be when they brought some software in, or even like a new process or something like that. And so I think that's kind of the first piece around how you have to take some time up front and make sure, okay, have we structured our projects correctly? Does our repository have the right folders and things? How are we going to go about data modeling and stuff like that? Spending some time up front to do this is important, but if you've already started, a health check can be a great way to have someone kind of look at things from a bird's eye view and assess where you're at currently today. And we'll get into what all kinds of things we like to look at for this health check, but yeah. And what was your second question?
Oh yeah, and what are some common pitfalls that you've seen? I mean, you've talked a little bit, I think, in at a high level, but maybe more concretely, what's a pattern that maybe creeps in, or some other sort of things that you've seen from your experience that when you've gone in as a consultant realized, oh, this is not the best way that this organization should be leveraging this tool?
Yeah, so I think I have two good examples. One of them is actually, it's somewhat less DBT related, and we'll talk more about data modeling. But again, going back to like DBT is such a great tool and easy to use and get onboarded with, especially for folks who are a little bit less technical, in that what you end up finding is you could have model sprawl, right? You have folks who are just starting to develop models and there's no real forethought into, okay, we should build some sort of conformed dimension here. We love talking about Kimball data modeling. If folks aren't familiar, they can go look up all sorts of smarter people than I, honestly, who have done a lot of thinking about how to model your data. But to maybe have rubber meet road a little bit, if you have models that are like in a presentation layer or like it's driving a report that are like 500 lines of SQL or something like that, you probably aren't doing something correct in terms of data modeling. And so what can happen with DBT is you can find yourself with models everywhere and not a lot of forethought into, okay, how do we best structure this stuff? And also gets into like an efficiency and like cost problem too, right?
Mhm.
When you're building repeat logic, you're managing metrics in multiple places. And that can also hurt trust and like things like data quality and stuff like that too, between the assets that you're producing and end users that are actually trying to use data and take action on it. And so that's one of the like first things that we look at as part of this health check is, are you actually modeling data in some way? And this could be not just Kimball, but it could be Data Vault. It could be something more Inman-esque, if you will. So anyways, that's the first one. The second one being, as your team grows, not thinking enough about like what is the developer experience like. And this gets into things like what is your IDE? Are you using dbt Cloud? But then also CI checks and stuff like that too. So like, are we checking that our code is up to some kind of standard? Do you have any sort of standards in place? Or is it more just like, hey, model works, let's merge it and here away we go. And so not taking enough time to think about, I'm a developer, what is the process of me gathering requirements to actually create something, and then the actual process of me spinning up an IDE, connecting to a database, actually writing that SQL, debugging, testing, stuff like that. But then also the merge process too. Are we preventing bad code from getting merged? That's going to cause problems for us. And bad code could mean a lot of different things, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with things like cross joins in SQL, where we're exploding tables and driving up costs on your data warehouse, right? And so having some oversight too, and like how is your team structured to prevent stuff like from that happening too, can be important. And so yeah, those are kind of two big things I love to look at: data modeling and just thinking about like the developer workflow, which can be kind of an ethereal concept, but we can get more into that soon.
Okay. So I heard if an organization is experiencing model sprawl with repeated logic, maybe different teams sort of using different definitions of logic, creating lack of trust in data, and they're using dbt, which is a tool that is supposed to resolve a lot of these problems, then it might be a good time to do a health check. Also, if the developer experience is starting to degrade, you're seeing maybe more errors, or you're not having a consistent CI check, that could be another good indicator. I will ask for the steps, but I also just wanted to talk a bit about why we call it a DBT health check. What do you think is like, what are we trying to communicate with that versus, hey, you should, go debug your code or something like that? Like, what's the difference in your mind?
Yeah, I think it's more about as we go about our day to day and we're like, hey, I got to get this task done. Okay, on to the next thing. There's not enough time spent like taking a step back, zooming out and looking at like, is this working? Is this tool serving us? Is it actually making us better at our jobs? And so a health check can be a great way to kind of like take a pause. And it's not everybody on the team that has to be a part of this, right? It's just about having someone who can come in and say, okay, let's take a little overview of everything that's going on in terms of DBT and anything that DBT is touching or is adjacent to, and taking a look to just see, is this tool actually working for you? Is it serving the needs that you originally brought the tool in for? Are you using all the features that you could possibly be leveraging? And a whole lot of other things. And I know we'll get into the steps here in just a moment, but that's really what I think about in terms of like thinking of health, right? The analogy I think of like a doctor give you go and get your physical or something like that. Is it's really having this periodic moment where we stop and take a look and say, okay, is this actually working for us? So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we should be healthy. We have to strive to be healthy every day, but every year
Yeah.
we should go to the doctor and make sure everything's working right.
Exactly, right. And this is one of those things where sometimes you can find that, okay, something isn't, it's one of those cases where like as a developer, maybe creating my own dev schema for some reason doesn't work for me because there's data somewhere and I don't want to copy it. And then so all of a sudden, like you might find that there are these processes that like as maybe like an engineering manager you weren't aware of, where folks who are actually doing DBT development are doing. And I'm sure there are many of other examples like this that have happened in organizations where people start doing things that aren't necessarily as part of some defined process that they should be doing.
Mhm.
And having this moment to come in and like interview your developers and ask like, what isn't working about this? Like, what pain points do you have when you're going through this process of, hey, I need to add a model, I need to work with the business to figure out what should be in here, and then let's actually develop it. And what is that process like when I develop and actually merge? And so what this can really be is a good opportunity to stop and actually go deeper into, as opposed to just looking at some KPIs on a dashboard, like our team is burning down really well this sprint, right? It's getting deeper into, are the processes actually working nicely for our developers? So
Great. Well, let me, I will pause on the slides and just, let's get into it. Help the audience think about how they might go about doing a DBT health check on their own. How does one do it? How do you recommend they start? And maybe this is a good time to, talk through the steps that we've outlined.
yeah, and so I kind of already maybe have touched upon a lot of the steps just in backwards or out of order, and a lot of these things happen in parallel, or can happen in parallel. But the first piece of it being in just interviewing, right? What I was just talking about in the previous question, spending the time to talk to your developers and ask, like, what is your experience like using this tool? How, like, are there pain points with your development experience? What kinds of things have you ran into where it's like, this isn't fun, or I had to copy data from here to here, and then I was able to do this? Like, where are these kind of anti-patterns happening? And so you can really only ever do this if you sit down, and actually put together a conversation and a set of questions to try to go deeper and understand what your developer's experience is like developing on your data platform. Because there can be a lot of decisions that you made around your data platform that can affect what the experience is actually like from a developer's perspective. And so that's really what the interviewing process is about. It's about uncovering things that maybe even developers don't even know aren't fun, because that's kind of the great thing about us being consultants, is that we get to see a lot of projects and implementations. And so what we can do is we can come in and ask questions, and just people explain their process to us, and then we realize, yeah, this isn't as good as it could be, but people just don't know what they don't know. So that's interviewing. And then what we get into next is reviewing your infrastructure. So this is more around, like, how is DBT running today? Are you running a DBT cloud? Are you running somewhere else? This also can be looking at things like, what does your project structure look like? Is it just DBT code that's going into your repository, or are you building like generators and utilities around it and stuff like that? And how do those tools work into the greater scheme of things? And then we look into data modeling. And again, this can be a huge piece of this. And it's something that applies not to just folks who are using DBT, but really anybody who's operating in data today. Having a look and being able to really assess, are we actually modeling our data in a way that serves our end users? Because we've seen it a lot where folks are using one big table, and they're having to carry values forward through a table, through some temporal data or something like that. And it can cause a lot of issues downstream when, like, changes need to be made to that. Can just make things very brittle. And so taking a step back and looking through, like, what's your data modeling process? Is there a data modeling process? And then looking through your actual DBT models to understand, are you defining things in multiple places? Yeah, just taking a pause there and just looking through what your data models look like. I know I made the point about like 500 lines of SQL code for your presentation layer. This is also like, are there layers in your DBT project too? We like to go from staging to kind of a transformation layer to actual presentation layer too. So that's data modeling. And then software development strategy. So this is actually looking at, like, what does your merge process look like? Do you have CI checks in place? I think we'll talk about the DBT project evaluator package at some point too, as a great tool to take a look at. Is your DBT project passing against a set of best practices? And there are a lot of rules that we can define with CI checks. And that's the beauty of continuous integration and, like, having those tests, is that we actually, instead of it being this implicit knowledge of a bunch of developers, like, my code should look like this, or I shouldn't do this thing in my code, whatever it might be, we actually explicitly write this logic out, and it either passes or it fails, right? And so this is something that if you're not doing, or you don't have a good strategy around how you're linting your code and formatting it, this is something that you really should be doing. And so that's why it's as part of this process too, as well as what the merge process and experience is like. What is promotion like? Is there a development branch to a release branch to actual main, stuff like that. So then the final piece being, if you're using an orchestrator, what does that look like? as well as things like monitoring too. So DBT obviously has a great testing framework as part of the tool. Have you defined too many tests where you have tests all over the place, testing the same column for uniqueness in multiple places? There's no real point in doing that. Maybe you should just do that in the staging layer. But then also, are those test results actually being used? We've seen it in the past where there's so many tests that it's kind of like too much signal and this just turns into noise basically. And people just stop using or actually looking at the tests that are failing. And so it's important to take a look at how that data is actually being used, if it is being used, and if there needs to be some kind of remediation there. And ultimately, this all culminates into a roadmap. And I think you'll probably end up asking me a little bit more about road mapping and why that's important. But yeah, we like to try to prioritize things so that you know this is something that really needs to change and fast because it has a big impact in terms of your costs, maybe, or there's some unmet needs, sorry, coming with your end users too. Perhaps they're not getting what they need fast enough, and so, or if data isn't, you're having some issues with data quality, and so you're losing trust between your data team and their stakeholders too. So we like to make a roadmap so we can help prioritize and knock those things out.
Yeah, thanks for running through that. It's very helpful to see. I do have a few kind of points that I wanted to dig in on, but I also want to just make sure that folks who are attending know we are going to end this in 9 minutes. So if you have questions for Tyler, get them in the Zoom chat, and we'll make sure to talk to them live. I think you had mentioned at the beginning of our chat, I think you specifically like the data modeling and the developer experience as being things that can degrade over time if people aren't paying attention to it. And you've got steps here to address both of those. I'm curious if you have, whether are you relying on your own expertise to develop like a checklist of best practices? Are there some publicly available resources that people can find if they don't know, like, is this the best practice? Is this how I should be using DBT? I think you alluded to maybe 1 or 2 examples, but I'm curious if you have some that you've used and that you really like.
Yeah, and so this comes in a lot of different places, right? DBT themselves put forth docs, and there's actually, I think it's just a folder within their docs pages where they list out their own best practices, some of which is like starting out on a project, what kind of layers should you have in your project in terms of like folders within your models folder. And so the docs can be a great place to start. Because it's what DBT Labs says is true. Now, obviously, this is a great place to start out, is using what DBT says in their best practices. But as we all know, once we get a tool in the door and people start getting their hands in there, they start to want to do things that maybe aren't as well documented, or they're just a little bit more advanced. And so there become a little bit less best practices around some of this stuff. And this is a great place where places like there's DBT Slack channel, which is obviously has a search function to it, as well as discourse forums too. There's a lot of great stuff on the DBT discourse forums. I'm active on there. I forget what my username is, but I'm sure people can find me. But discourse is a great place too. It's something that DBT runs themselves. There's a lot of good, almost more like blog posts. And DBT also has a technical blog as well, where they outline a lot of this kind of stuff too. So those are great places to start. I think something else, and we talked about the project evaluator package, similar to talking about CI and having tests that are actually explicitly defined. DBT supports and maintains this package called the DBT project evaluator package. And what this really does is it tests for a number of different things. Actually, you can see the rules in their documentation. I won't rattle all of them off, but it gives you an explicit way to look at your DBT project to say, are we actually modeling things right? Are we using models in multiple places where we should condense it into one, or logic in multiple places? And so this evaluator package is actually pretty awesome at doing this kind of stuff, among many other things, checking like, do you have tests on enough models or stuff like that? So yeah, those are the things that come to mind. Obviously, you can also find me in DBT Slack. I'm happy to help people out if they need it. So,
All right. Great. And you called it. I did want to ask you a little bit more about like what a roadmap, what do we mean when we say like, okay, we did this health check, now we have a roadmap. Like, what does that look like? How do we know what's important and to how to prioritize that against all the other work that a data team has to do?
Yeah, and so a lot of this comes down to actually assessing the impact. So if you go through this process, the first step is actually not even a roadmap, because roadmap is like we should do this first and then this next, right? And so there's a set of dependencies where something should happen before another. But the important part about this is that after you go through this process and you understand, hey, there are pain points, or we don't have enough CI checks, and this is causing some problems in terms of we have jobs that fail because we have some code that ends up getting entered incorrectly or whatever it might be. The important piece to this being is actually assessing the value of that. If you have a DBT job that fails, multiple times a week, and you have to spend, you have to put a couple developers on it, it takes some X amount of hours, right? There's actual tangible value to trying to make that better and prevent those failures from happening. And so it's really about a process, depending on what it is, of actually going through and assessing what is most worthwhile for us doing. And does not just have to be on the cost side of things, right? Because data modeling, if we're driving up our compute to repeat logic in a bunch of different places, like that's costly and expensive for no reason. But on the other side of it being, is your business, like stakeholders, are they actually deriving value from what you're producing in terms of data assets? Are they even using them? Is there trust, stuff like that? And so really putting together a roadmap is about prioritization and actually trying to tie things to actual tangible value. And so after that, you can go about a whole process and put it in whatever your favorite project management tool is, actually listing out like what are those tasks and stuff like that. So anyways, yeah.
Great, thanks. I do see a couple of questions in the chat, so I will jump over there before we wrap up. Mohammed from Toronto is asking, what's the best practice of using DBT snapshots in production? There's less documentation on this. They've been using DBT for the past year. Do you have any tips?
Great question. So there is a little bit of documentation on snapshots. Snapshots at the end of the day, if people aren't familiar, it's just a slowly changing type 2 dimension. So it's just tracking changes. So you can define, there are a couple different strategies. I won't get into the technical detail there, but in terms of best practices for snapshots, almost always you should use snapshots to just take your raw data that's just being landed in your warehouse and snapshotting that. The problem with snapshotting things later on in your DAG or in your data model process, your transformation, lineage, whatever you want to say, is that as you define logic and then try to snapshot that logic, if you change the logic, you start to have conflicts and issues downstream. And so snapshotting downstream is just something that you really shouldn't do. There is one caveat to that, and that is, especially if you work in like you're processing data for financial reasons, and you produce a report and say, this is what is true at this point in time from like a report. So this is like all the way on the far right end of your lineage. You're producing a report from a DBT model. There is a use case to snapshot those two, because you're snapshotting what is true about that point in time. So that's like the big thing that comes to mind for snapshots.
James has a question about any suggestions on videos or YouTubes that show how DBT is utilized? Is Discourse one? I do know that DBT Labs' YouTube channel has a lot of content, and a lot of it is very practitioner focused and industry focused, so you can see the different use cases live. Anything you'd add, Tyler?
Yeah, DBT has a great course like system or whatever you want to say, coursework. And I'm blanking on what the URL for that would be, but I think you can find
Yeah,
on
training. Yeah, training.
Yep, training, exactly. And obviously you can spin up DBT Cloud for free and just go hands-on if you have some kind of database to connect to, or you can do it locally too. But their coursework is awesome. I've heard great things. I actually haven't gone through all of it myself. I like to be a little bit more just like download the thing, figure it out, and just do it on my own. So, but yes, DBT's got some great training online as well, so that's a great place to go.
Great. Okay, and as promised, I said I would end this call at 30 minutes. Thank you so much, Tyler, for the conversation. Thank you, everyone who attended. I hope that you have something that you can take back to your workplace and your work. We will share, folks, the recording of this call. You can listen to it whenever you like. Please feel free to reach out to me or Tyler if you have questions. You can find us on LinkedIn, the DBT community Slack. We're easy to reach. So yeah, thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.